CRSJ education series on okay, the team is on top of this. They have all the information in front of us, but I want to welcome all of you for joining the last of our Civil Rights and Social Justice Education series. We are very happy to have this conversation as it relates to the price paid for Brown, the desegregation and expulsion of teachers, and the implications then and now. And we're especially looking at how COVID-19 has really highlighted the disparities in education. I look forward to our continued efforts in the area of education. The American Bar Association is committed to this work, and we have an incredible panel of individuals today who will be talking with you about the series and talking with you also in terms of what these implications have been. And we are going to start off with an esteemed panelist, Dr. Leslie Fenwick. Dr. Fenwick is Dean Emeritus of the Howard University School of Education and a tenured professor of educational policy and leadership. During her tenure as Dean, Howard University School of Education for the first time attained U.S. News and World Report's ranking as one of the nation's top 100 schools. She is a former visiting scholar and visiting fellow at Harvard University and is currently Dean in Residence at the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Education. Dr. Fenwick is nationally known for education policy leadership studies, and she's a former urban K-12 school teacher and administrator. She is co-founder of the American Association of School Administrators Urban Superintendents Academy and a past member of the Harvard University Principal Center Advisory Board. Notably, Dr. Fenwick served as an appointed member of the National Academy of Sciences Committee that produced the first study about mayoral control of Washington, D.C.'s public schools. Dr. Fenwick is described as a fearless advocate for education equity and is regularly called upon to testify about education equity and college access to the U.S. Senate, the Congressional Black Caucus, the National Conference of State Legislators, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and so many other government and civil rights groups, both domestic and global. And finally, Dr. Fenwick is a contributor to the best-selling book, The Last Word, Controversy and Commentary in American Education. And we can look forward to her forthcoming book, Jim Crow's Pink Slip, Public Policy and the Near Decimation of Black Educational Leadership After Brown, which has been cited by the New York Times and Education Week and the Center for American Progress. And so Dr. Fenwick has an extensive bio that I would encourage you to read online, but at this time we are going to allow Dr. Fenwick to present you with her information on this very timely subject.
She's muted.
Is that better?
Yes.
Oh, very good. Sorry about that. Thank you for the warm introduction, and I'm absolutely delighted and honored to be participating in this conversation with the American Bar Association about education equity and the price paid for Brown. My remarks are centered around this notion that the past is not just prologue, it's ever present. You'll occasionally see me glancing down as we go through these slides, and I look at my notes. And so let me just share my screen quickly. And I am mindful of our agreement to take no more than 15 minutes per panelist. So I'd like to begin by talking about some of the context. The the philosophical context and also some demographic realities that are driving a conversation about diversity in the US and that have set the tone for what we're looking at in school systems relative to diversity in the student population and the educator workforce. And one of the most, I think, profound quotes that I've read about diversity in the US, linking it to schools and school children and the nation's future, is the one that I have here on the screen from the Carnegie Forum on Education and the Economy, stating that we cannot tolerate a future in which both white and minority children are confronted with almost exclusively white authority figures in their school. Now, it was in the mid-'80s that the Carnegie Forum on Education and the Economy reached this conclusion, and we're still walking out the nation's commitment to diversity. I think this is such an important and profound quote and provocative quote, because all children, all American children, deserve diverse models of intellectual authority in their classroom. It teaches children explicitly that the work of knowledge generation, the work of creativity, the ability to have intellectual prowess belongs to all people. It doesn't belong exclusively to whites or white males. It belongs to all people. This is the value of having diverse models of intellectual authority in schools. Demographically, we know that within the very near future, the US population will, for the first time in its history, be, and I hate this phrase, but I'll use it for now, majority minority, meaning that most US citizens will be people of color and not identify as white. And that should be coupled with, within the next 20 to 25 years, the reality that more than half of the US workforce will be people of color as well. So to date, our political and economic structure has had people of color and the poor at its margins, but to continue this experiment that we call democracy and to continue the work of public education, we're going to have to do something different to meet the demands of a new demographic era. I'll quickly review some of the diversity statistics about our public school students. Again, this is background and context to the conversation about diversity in the educator workforce. As you see here, for the first time in the history of the nation, beginning in fall 2015, the majority of our public schools the student population became students or children of color. About 7% of those children belong to one of the groups categorized as Asian American, American Indian, or Pacific Islander, about 15% Black, about 25% Hispanic, Latinx, many, 4%, the highest percentage since NCES, the National Center for Ed Statistics, has been tracing this, identify with more than one racial or ethnic group, and 49% white. Also in the fall of 2015, 51% of pre-K public school students were identified as coming from families experiencing poverty. So these big shifts, we're now 5 years into these shifts, and these percentages are not abating, they're growing. In other words, our PK-12 public schools are becoming more diverse and also populated by more children who are in families experiencing poverty. I like to share the statistic on English language learners, ELL students, because most people believe that ELL students are foreign born. But in fact, 78% of our ELL students are US born citizens. Again, speaking to the diversity of our public school system, public school student population. Who's teaching whom? Do we see this saying, the diversity that we see in the student population, do we also see in the educator workforce? Well, the answer to that is no. 91% of urban school teachers are white. So if we just go to urban centers, 91% of teachers nationally, there are some districts that deviate from this national pattern, but 91% of urban school teachers are white. Go inside urban centers to inner city schools, and 73% of teachers are white, and about 68% of inner city school principals are also white. So this really speaks to this idea that there's an underrepresentation of people of color in public school systems serving as members of the educator workforce. And in fact, nearly 40% of US schools have no teacher of color. No teacher of color. This underrepresentation is also coupled with another reality. If we were a school, all the folks who are participating in this webinar today, I think it's about 300 or so, and 50% of us were children of color, and 50% of us were on free or reduced lunch, which is one indicator of poverty status. We would be, as students, 70% more likely to have a teacher, 70% more likely than our white and affluent peers to have a teacher who's not certified teaching us, and 70% more likely to have a teacher who doesn't even have a college major or minor in the subject area that they're teaching. And this finding holds true across 4 subject areas: math, science, social studies, and English. It's a horrible statistic because it tells us that we've in some cases lowered the bar on who teaches, while we've simultaneously raised the expectation about how students perform on high-stakes standardized tests. And in fact, about 80% of African-American students exist in states that have high-stakes standardized tests. Before we know the child's ability or his or her family circumstances, we can see from this statistic that we've already circumscribed the educational experience that too many Black, brown, and poor children have. 70% more likely, just by being poor and a child of color, to have someone teaching you a subject that they're not certified to teach you, and don't have a college major or minor in that subject area. So you can guess what the outcomes on these high-stakes standardized tests would be, given that reality. And here, in this slide, I'm reviewing for you diversity in the PK-12 educator workforce, again as background to where we are now. My next slides, I'm going to talk about how we got there. In the teaching population, you can see that the majority of the nation's teachers, 80%, are white, about 8% are Black. There's a history to this 8% that we'll be discussing as part of this webinar. And about 7% of the teaching force, the 3.2 million teachers in the country, are Hispanic Latinx. You go to the next group, principals. We have about 93,200 principals in the US public school system. And here again, over 80% are white, about 11% are African-American or Black, and about 5 to 6%, it's kind of growing, are Hispanic Latinx. Now look at the superintendency, 13,800 superintendents in the country. The overwhelming majority are white, about 3% are Black, and about 2% Hispanic Latinx. Even though public education in this country is a notoriously female-friendly field, and we still find that white males as a group disproportionately occupy the policy, funding, and leadership positions coagulated around the superintendency and associate superintendencies, even though white males represent less than 7% of the teaching force from which we typically recruit to the principalship and the superintendency. So why is diversity in the teaching force important for students of color, and particularly for all students, but particularly for students of color? I outline some of the research that we have here from more than 30 years of education research, many longitudinal studies that have found that when Black and Hispanic Latinx students are in high diversity staffed schools, they're more likely to graduate high school in 4 years, more likely to be placed in gifted education, less likely to be misplaced in special ed, less likely to be suspended or expelled, more likely to apply to and enroll in college. And for certain grades, particularly 4th and 8th grades, they have higher standardized test score gains in math, reading comprehension, and vocabulary. So here, from these longitudinal studies that I'm just summarizing in these bullet points, more than 30 years of research is showing the benefit of diversity, diverse models of intellectual authority in the classroom for children, particularly Black and Hispanic Latinx students. So how did we get here with only 7% of 8% of the nation's teachers being Black? There's a distinct history, and I want to uncouple 2 myths. And if time permits, I'd like to come back later after you hear from the other panelists and read some excerpts from my forthcoming book. So the first myth that we hear all the time from people, well, you know, just average conversation to experts, is that with desegregation, with the Brown decision, Blacks left traditional fields like teaching to pursue these other careers that were newly open to them. That myth is exactly that. It's not historic. And in fact, in my book, I trace the history using a variety of historical documents to identify the fact, which is that white defiance of the law of the land, which at the time was Brown, resulted in massive firings and demotions of Black principals and teachers by white superintendents and school boards. This was deliberate action. It's chronicled in a variety of historical documents and minutes and reports. So prior to Brown, about 35 to 50% of teachers in the 17 or 18 dual system states were Black. In every state, Blacks who were fired and demoted were replaced by lesser qualified whites. And today there's no state that approaches the earlier percentage range of 35 to 50%. There are some excerpts, as I mentioned, that I would like to cite, would like to read from my book a bit later. One of the most exciting moments of doing this research was looking at a memorandum written by Thurgood Marshall in 1952 when he created the NAACP's Teacher Information and Security Department. Because in 1952, Thurgood Marshall and the attorneys who were litigating Brown knew that Black teachers and principals were going to lose their jobs if Brown was successful. And they knew they were going to lose the jobs, not because they weren't qualified, but because of racism, structural racism. And they were preparing through the Teacher Information and Security Department of the NAACP to have resources to defend those principals and teachers who lost their jobs, who were demoted or fired. The second myth that my book attacks is the myth that Black educators are not as qualified as white educators. This was a constant mantra among the superintendents who were firing Black principals and teachers during desegregation, when Black schools were closed and Black students were sent to white schools, that these Black educators had to be let go because they weren't qualified. But the fact is that the nation's most credentialed educators, then prior to 1954 and now, are Black educators. Black principals and superintendents are more likely to hold master's and doctoral degrees and have more years of professional experience in their prior education posts than white educators. One of the interesting twists of Jim Crow and segregation was that we had 18 dual system states, and in those states, through K-12 education into higher education, Blacks and whites were not educated together. So many Blacks attended HBCUs, but if they were seeking a graduate degree in a field that was not offered at the state HBCU or a private HBCU in the state, they were given Negro tuition scholarships, which they took primarily to 5 institutions. where they earned their doctorates, and then they returned to southern states to work as principals and teachers. And those 5 institutions were New York University, Columbia University, The Ohio State, University of Michigan, University of Pennsylvania, and I'll add a 6th, which was Iowa. So these individuals who were educated at HBCUs but not allowed to attend graduate programs in the 18 southern states that were white reserved, took those Negro tuition scholarships issued by the states and went to these primary Northeastern, Midwestern institutions, earned graduate degrees, master's and doctoral degrees, and returned to the South to teach in dirt floor schools in some cases. This is a really central piece to the unpacking of the underrepresentation of Blacks in the US educator workforce, that we lost as a nation an exceptionally committed and credentialed group of educators when we went through DSEG. And again, I'd like to read some excerpts from the book as time permits. So among the other residuals to the resistance to Brown, there are several formulas and schemes masquerading as urban school reform. One, I believe, as a former teacher in urban schools myself and a former administrator, is Teach for America. And it's a model that has relied on putting hundreds of thousands of uncertified teachers, I hesitate to use the word teachers, but uncertified individuals in urban school classrooms serving the nation's neediest students who tend to be Black, brown, and poor. Interestingly enough, as a group of attorneys, you would find this interesting that the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that that model of having teachers in training coagulated in urban schools, and that those individuals could not be considered highly qualified, and that the model in the decision actually uses this language, is discriminatory and harmful to students in schools serving disproportionately minority, Black, and poor students. The other schemes that we see that have their roots in resistance to desegregation, vouchers, charters, and tuition grants, and I draw your attention to a piece that I wrote about vouchers titled The Voucher Scheme Again, Really, and it appears in Phi Delta Kappa, and it's a very digestible piece. We know that Secretary DeVos has highlighted vouchers in the state of Indiana as you know, a high-performing voucher state, but the facts don't show that the vouchers that are being promulgated are actually reaching the students intended. I don't agree with the model, but in addition to that, you know, almost half of the Indiana students receiving vouchers are from families whose incomes are over $55,000, and only 20% of the Indiana school kids who receive vouchers were from families experiencing poverty, and the overwhelming majority of voucher recipients in Indiana are white. This is a model state that our secretary has cited. But the faces of Black, brown, and poor children are used to promulgate these schemes, vouchers, for-profit charters, and tuition grants. And each of these is not new. Each has its roots in resistance, white resistance to the Brown decision. So at the end of the day, what recommendations do I have for diversifying the US educator workforce and responding to the decimation, the deliberate decimation of the Black teacher pipeline? I raised 4 critical questions. You know, how do we create common cause communities to better include scholars of color at HBCUs, Hispanic serving institutions, and other minority serving institutions? These institutions are producing the nation's lion's share of Black and brown teachers. HBCUs are 3% of the nation's 4,500 colleges and universities, and yet they produce 50% of Black teachers. 2 HSIs, 2 Hispanic serving institutions, 1 in California, 1 in Texas, produce 90% of the nation's Hispanic Latinx teachers. So if we lost HBCUs and HSIs, we would lose the nation's teachers of color. So what can we do to create some common cause communities with traditionally white institutions to open this pipeline and repair the deliberate decimation of Black teachers? Are we sufficiently listening to those who've done the work of teaching and leading schools that successfully educate Black and Hispanic Latinx students? Do we have enough asset-based, strength-based research to overcome this deficit-based data and perspectives that dominate about Black and Hispanic Latinx students and misguide then practice and policy solutions? And have we sufficiently and publicly interrogated the harm that schemes like Teach for America, for-profit charters, and vouchers are today causing Black, Hispanic, Latinx, and poor students? With that said, I'll stop. I have a series of references that I can make certain that the group receives. So thank you, Cynthia, for giving me a few minutes. And I'd like to go back later if we have time and read some relevant sections of the book manuscript.
Leslie, thank you so much. We really appreciate all of that information. It's definitely set the foundation for the conversation moving forward as we begin to talk about the unintended consequences of Brown and how it has continued to permeate public education to this day. And in that regard, we are going to move on to Dr. Reg Weaver. Dr. Weaver is the past president of the then 3.2 million member National Education Association, which is the nation's largest professional employee organization with a commitment to advancing the cause of public education. And it is also the world's largest democratic deliberative body. Dr. Weaver has also served as Vice President of Education International, which is a foundation or a federation, of approximately 400 associations and unions in more than 170 countries and territories, representing over 30 million educators in global education institutions, from early childhood through university. As a middle school science teacher and a 30-year veteran of the classroom, Weaver has been a lifelong advocate for quality public schools. His advocacy has spanned from schoolhouse to state house to house. He is an exemplar, thoughtful, intelligent leadership toward redefining the current public education system and ensuring equity in education for all students. Weaver delivered a landmark speech at the Lincoln Cathedral in England, home to a rare copy of the Magna Carta, as a matter of fact, that was met with widespread acclaim. And during that time, he was also provided with a cornerstone at the cathedral, and he was given an honorary doctorate by that university. He is a recognized expert on public education issues, serves on numerous boards, has testified before Congress on federal education policy, and has frequently provided a critical voice on public education for nationally recognized publications, as well as televised and broadcast media. His commitment and contributions to public education haven't gone unnoticed, and he has received countless awards. And he has been recognized both domestically as well as globally. So President Weaver's more extensive bio is available online, and we look forward to the information that he will give us as we start to speak about how teachers' unions were impacted and helped move past the unintended consequences of Brown.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. And once again, it's really nice being able to be with Tanya and Congressman Scott and Leslie, individuals who have and continue to do so much for our communities. And Cynthia, thank you so much for always being there to make sure messages that should be available to the public are available. I'd like to talk a little bit about the teacher organizations back in the day. And I'd like to start with Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. And it gave legitimacy to state laws that were sanctioning racial segregation, barring Blacks from sharing buses in schools and other public facilities as whites. And while these Jim Crow laws stood for 6 decades, Black Americans were working hard to establish schools for Black children. And in the 1870s and 90s, independent Black teacher associations were formed in about 11 southern states, Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, North Carolina, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Texas, Virginia, and West Virginia. The Black teachers, they wanted to increase the value of Black children's education. They wanted to be able to ensure a better health for the Black community. They wanted to improve school buildings and equipment, and they also wanted to have a better opportunity to prepare Black teachers to be teachers. And then, lo and behold, the Great Depression came on Black Thursday, October 24th, 1929, and with it ushered in an era of unemployment, which at its peak, about 25% of the workforce, nearly 15 million people, were without jobs. And you had widespread poverty and suffering and homelessness and hunger and malnutrition and poor health. Those became the nation's reality. And during that time, for example, an association in Arkansas, they were closely aligned with national organizations such as the National Congress of Colored Parents and Teachers, the American Association, the American Teachers Association, the National Association of Teachers in Colored Schools. And they were working with those groups to improve the conditions for teachers and kids in Black schools. But by 1937, because of the conditions, the membership in the Arkansas Teachers Association, the Black teacher organization, their membership had declined nearly 23%. And that basically was the same with the other Black teacher organizations throughout the southern states. So you had your Black teacher associations in states across the South, again, were faced with many of the same kinds of conditions. And so with the Depression, you had retrenchment. That became the buzzword. It became the buzzword for budget cuts. It became the buzzword that resulted in the reduction in hours that schools operated, increased class sizes, decades or decreases in teacher salaries, and poor school districts in the rural South, in the rural areas. And they were closed. And with the closing of those schools, you had Black students that were facing racism, they were facing poverty, they were facing neglect. They were, as you can imagine, severely impacted. And Black schools were particularly hit hard. And then enter Brown versus the Board of Education, the landmark 1954 Supreme Court case in which the justices ruled unanimously that racial segregation of children in public schools was unconstitutional. And Brown was one of the cornerstones of the civil rights movement and helped establish the precedent that separate but equal education and other services were not in fact equal. And this decision, for the first time, afforded Black children access to the same educational opportunities as white children. But, and you know, when you think about Brown, we always think about primarily what has happened with the kids. But many don't realize and they don't think about what happened with the Black teachers and the Black superintendents. And I know, being in the profession for years, I never thought about it. And then when it started to become more prevalent on the radar screen, it was very interesting because Brown had a number of unintended consequences, which to some, the effects of which are still felt today. It caused the dismissal and the demotion and forced resignation of many experienced and highly qualified Black teachers. And after the Brown decision, tens of thousands of Black leaders or teachers and principals, they lost their jobs. As Leslie said, white superintendents began to integrate the schools, but balked at putting Black educators in positions of authority over white teachers and students. Now, there are a number of examples that one could cite that speaks to the kinds of actions that were occurring with white superintendents replacing Black teachers with white teachers. One such example I can give you was in 1953, when a year before the Brown case, superintendent in Topeka, Kansas, told one of the teachers by the name of Darla Buchanan that the people in Topeka don't want to see a Negro teacher teaching white children. And as a result, you will no longer have a job working in this district. There are a number of other court cases that can be cited that speaks to the negative impact that the decision had on Black teachers who were dismissed from school districts. And in some instances, they may have filed suit claiming that they were dismissed because of their race. But of course, the courts denied their claim. And so they just had to move on as a result. Now, the Black Teachers Associations at the state levels, they recognized that there were a number of things that were going on that they needed assistance on. And so they reached out to their national organization, and it was at that time the National Association of Colored Teachers, which later became known as the American Teachers Association, also called the ATA. And again, that was the national organization of teachers in Black schools. And during the 1930s and the 1950s, the ATA, amazing, they made possible, as Leslie has indicated, scores of teacher salary cases, providing funds and plaintiffs and reports and expert witnesses for legal cases filed by the NAACP. So the Black Teacher Association was gathering this information to provide to the NAACP for purposes of filing suit as a result of Brown. And so post-Brown, you had Black teacher associations across the country. They were reeling from the implications of Brown. The white teacher organizations, both at the state and the national level, were realizing the impact that Brown was having. And so as a result of the Black teacher organizations feeling one way and the white teacher organizations beginning to have that same feeling, the murmur of a merger began due to the fact that Black and white educators began to demonstrate their concern for the unity and the integrity of the education profession. And with that murmur, in 1963, the National Education Association's Representative Assembly, they asked the Joint Committee to report back to the 1964 Representative Assembly about if and under what conditions the ATA and the NEA should merge. keeping in mind, NEA at the national level was one organization. The ATA representing Black teachers was at the other end. This particular new business item asks to see if and under what condition those two organizations should talk about merger. The NEA also developed criteria for evaluating merger agreements and establishing 1969 as the deadline for the completion of mergers at the state level. So what the NEA was saying was that those state affiliates, those state associations that had white teacher organizations and Black teacher organizations, they gave them until 1969 to merge as one. And then in 1964, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, which outlawed racial discrimination in public accommodations, public education, employment, apprentice programs, union membership, and to some extent, voting. Again, the NEA passed Resolution 12, which mandated that state affiliates had to merge with the ATA counterparts. So by 1969, the NEA Representative Assembly said by 1969, it was mandatory that state Black and white organizations where they existed had to merge. And although 11 state affiliates had not emerged by 1966, in 1966, after a lot of collaboration and cooperation and negotiations, the NEA and the ATA merged. They merged at the NEA Representative Assembly in Miami Beach, Florida. And that was a happy day for so many. Now within the NEA, it became, after this merger, within the NEA, it became clear that the newly merged affiliates, they were struggling with their new integrated status. And Black educators were being marginalized and their growth within the organization was being halted. Keep in mind, the Blacks who were merged with the NEA, they had their own organization and they had their own position. But when they came into the NEA, they found that those positions that they previously had, their position was being marginalized. And in essence, there wasn't a place for them, they felt. And so in 1970, the NEA had their convention in San Francisco, California. And it was at that time that the Nea Black Caucus was formed. And the Nea Black Caucus was made up primarily of Black educators from the ATA. And actually, the Black Caucus continues to exist today, chaired by Cecily Myrick Cruz out of California. And this was the first of many coming togethers that Black educators had during NEA meetings, and that still exists today. And they came together because they wanted to make an impact on what was happening with Black children and Black educators that were existing in the NEA as well as the rest of the world. Now, we have a teacher association. They're integrated in public schools and post-ground, but there still seems to be a lot of issues that continue to exist as a result of Brown. And so where are our efforts today as it relates to diversity in the teaching ranks? I think Leslie has spoken about it extremely well. And again, today, many scholars say that the persistent lack of Black teachers in the profession can be traced to the aftermath of Brown. And we have not yet rectified the decimation of Black principals and Black teachers in the pipeline. As Leslie, I think, alluded to, prior to Brown, In the 17 states that had segregated school systems, 35 to 50% of the teaching force was Black. And according to the most recent federal data, about 7% of public school teachers and 11% of public school principals are Black. Post-Brown decision, standardized tests were used to deny Black educators the opportunity to teach. States implemented certification measures that led to Black teachers being fired or school districts not renewing their contracts. And between 1984 and 1989, about 21,500 Black teachers were displaced because of new requirements for teacher education programs and certification. And if that wasn't enough, we were moving along, making progress where we could. People like Congressman Scott making sure that educational opportunities continue to exist. Tanya was out there making sure that they continue to exist. Leslie was out there making sure that the opportunities continue to exist. Cynthia was doing what she could and wherever she was to make the opportunities continue to exist. And lo and behold, what happens? You got the coronavirus hits. And when that hit, it has a tremendous impact. And the longer that it goes, many kids are being denied an education, and many are losing what they learned if they have to continue to stay out of school. And this virus has impacted millions of students and closed down many schools. And the challenges that this virus presents are many, and they have forced school districts across the nation to take the necessary steps to not only protect the health and the safety of those students, but address the academic as well as their social and mental needs. Many people think of school only where you have teaching and learning occurring. But schools are more than just brick and mortar, as Representative Scott will tell you, as Tanya will tell you, as Leslie will tell you. So much goes on in schools that we don't even talk about, but are essential. Many teachers and professors are attempting to conduct lessons and provide and assess assignments and communicate with the students online. And they're trying to do this even though many of them have not had the training. And once they do get the training, then they have to try to work with the students, but not only have to work with the students, they have to work with the parents as well. The teacher unions, I think, are doing a pretty good job in terms of coordinating developments, lessons that they pass out to the folks that they represent. The support staff are doing a great job in terms of making sure that the kids are continued to be fed. So it's all there, but I don't know. I guess we'll be able to make it through, but that's my presentation. So thanks for listening.
Thank you, Reg. We really appreciate your insights. And I think that for many, and from some that I'm seeing with personal texts that are coming that aren't necessarily coming through the chat, folks were not aware of the type of background that you and Dr. Fenwick had provided in terms of what was happening immediately post-Brown and what is happening today. And they especially were not aware of the merger of the Black teachers unions with the NEA and how that ultimately drove us to where we are today with a fully merged set of teachers unions. I now want to bring to your attention and bring to the fore Attorney Tanya Clayhouse. She is currently the Senior Program Officer for Voting Rights at the State Infrastructure Fund and manages their voting rights portfolio, including all of the national litigation funding. This includes management of the Voting Rights Working Group, which is comprised of 11 of the nation's premier civil rights organizations engaged in voting rights litigation. As a Senior Program Officer, Ms. House works directly with major foundations and funders and supports the fundraising goals of the State Infrastructure Fund. She is also a co-founder of her own consulting firm, Clay House Consulting, and she has quite an impressive client list there as well. She is the former Deputy Assistant Secretary for P through 12 Education in the Office of Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development at the U.S. Department of Education. And as the Deputy Assistant Secretary and leader of the P through 12 team, she made recommendations to the Assistant Secretary and other senior department officials on a host of policy initiatives. In addition to the reauthorization and subsequent implementation of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, Ms. House oversaw the development of policy in the P through 12 budget and spending plan was responsible for policy recommendations and decisions for major grant competitions. Ms. House also led high priority policy initiatives across the Department of Education, including work on school diversity and discipline practices and the racial justice implications of policies throughout the department. Prior to her assignment there, I think it's very important to note that Tanya served as the director of the Public Policy Department at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, where she not only worked on voting rights, but she also headed up a great deal of efforts and activities around education policy there. And she formerly served on as Public Policy Director at People for the American Way as well. Tanya has an extensive, a very extensive bio. I encourage you to check it online. Please be sure to go and check that out. It brings to this conversation a great deal of insight, experience, and background in public education policy. And Tanya, I look forward to hearing your remarks.
Great. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. It's always amusing to hear your background read back to you and reminded of how old you are. And so thank you for that, Cynthia. And I really did and have appreciated hearing the presentations of both Dr. Fenwick and also Dr. Weaver, who I affectionately just call Reg. And it's such a pleasure to be on the panel, of course, with everyone here, including my favorite Congressman, Congressman Bobby Scott. So I am charged with talking about the civil rights protections and the issues that we are continuing to deal with, regardless of the impact of COVID-19 and the protections that our students still have. So what I'm going to do, providing that, and I just, as a reminder of the state that we live in, I have 2 young children who are, I think, battling outside of my office. So hopefully you will not hear them when I'm giving my presentation. I have informed them that I'm trying to do a presentation, but like all of us who are parents, we are in the midst of being working while being a teacher, while also being a disciplinarian. So I just ask for your forgiveness should I have to scream at somebody really quickly. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen at this point in time to start my presentation. All right. Are you able to see this presentation, everyone? Okay. All right. So, as I said, I'm here to kind of focus on the educational civil rights and COVID-19. And one of the things, that I have really appreciated, as I said, during this conversation is the history lesson. And it was, like many of us, I was not as familiar about some of the history, particularly around the teachers' unions. And it's been extremely helpful to hear also Dr. Fenwick, again, speak about the data that exists. And so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that. I simply wanted to highlight a few issues here regarding the resegregation within our public school system. And as reported in my bio, one of the points that the issues that I did work on when I was at the Department of Education was dealing with the racial and socioeconomic diversity within our schools and trying to ensure ways in which we could continue the efforts of Brown v. Board of Education, which means providing an equality education to all of our students. And so as we note here on the screen, while we have become more diverse, as reported recently in the National Center for Education Statistics, in the last data set that we had collected, the percentage of white students enrolled in our public school systems has decreased to actually less than 50%. And on the other hand, the percentage of Hispanics has risen, as well as the proportion of Asian Pacific Islanders, API. And at the same time, there has been a slight decrease of percentage of Black students. Now, this was in 2017. I have to see some of the recent data that's come out as of late. But regardless, the point of this is that we have a majority of students of color within our public school systems, as we've been talking about. And so the impact upon, or the impact of issues like COVID-19 is real, particularly among students of color. And so despite the fact that we have this increase of students of color in our schools, this proportion, we never got to the hope and the dream and the reality of Brown v. Board, which was to achieve that equality of education by ensuring that all of our students, ensuring that their opportunities provided to Black and Brown students as well. And so we have seen actually a retreat in our public school systems, actually from even when they were at their peak of integration and desegregation in the 1980s. Some of the issues that I want to focus on today are some of the issues, the impact that is affecting, of COVID-19 and how that's impacting our students, particularly our vulnerable populations. First and foremost, racial and socioeconomic disparity concerns. As we've heard, there is a huge digital divide among students of color within our schools, or just among students of color, period. The lack of resources is real. We know that there is, as we go into remote learning, we don't have the resources for many of our students to be able to actually effectively engage in remote learning. To the point that I've even recently heard, as of yesterday, that some states are closing, they're shutting down their school remote learning early, upwards of a month, potentially almost a month early, simply because they're not able to effectively engage in it. We're also concerned about the redistribution of federal funds towards vouchers, which Leslie also Dr. Fenwick highlighted. The widening of our achievement gap, because we're also, because of the remote learning and the lack of ability of many students to engage. The impact upon our homeless students. We haven't talked about it as much about our other vulnerable populations, which also happen to be disproportionately students of color. And then also, simply put, just food insecurity. We know that our schools are where many of our students receive their majority of food throughout the day. And that is a real concern in terms of even ensuring that they're able to learn. If they don't have the food that is necessary in order to fill their bodies, they're not going to be focused on anything else. And so this is a real concern in terms of providing the protections to our students. Students with disabilities, we are facing concerns about the waiver of the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act requirements. That has been an issue that we are confronting with the current secretary, who, among other things, doesn't necessarily believe in public education and is also interested in redistributing funds and enabling a certain amount of waivers. And we'll get into that a little bit later. And then we're also concerned about, in fact, just the actual lack of remote learning. Some districts we've heard about are in fact not even providing remote learning for our students with disabilities. In addition to this, we also are dealing with just general issues of discrimination and civil rights protections, and racial discrimination, disability discrimination, if I indicated, sex discrimination and bullying and harassment that can particularly is happening against students, but in particular against Asian Pacific or Asian Pacific Islander students because of, unfortunately, number 45's use of the term that this is a Chinese virus. And so, using that term has encouraged inordinate amount of bullying and harassment that, in fact, many our organizations are having to deal with, in addition to trying to protect their students and ensure that they are getting the learning that they need. As indicated, so I'm going to focus on each of these issues separately for a little bit, and I'm going to try to be responsible with my time. As I don't remember exactly what time I started, Cynthia, but I know you'll ping me when I'm gone over. Let me just say here. So again, we know that there is a concentration of populations. I'm sorry, I think I messed that. Yeah, within our schools of children that are particularly impacted by or have low socioeconomic status. And so that concentration in our public schools means that they're able to devote less time and attention to their academic instruction. We have parents who are not able to homeschool. They don't have time for this. They don't have childcare. They're not able to meet the childcare needs. And so even with distance learning being established, many of our children at home, they just don't have access. They don't have the internet access. We talked about the digital divide. 35% of our low-income households with school-age children don't have high-speed internet. And it goes, when we're looking at race and ethnicity, the gap is even greater amongst African-American and Hispanic families. I want to focus a little bit on vouchers. This is a real concern, and I know Congressman Scott will get to this as well. We have an administration that has been focused since the beginning of the administration, of trying to divert federal funds to voucher programs. These proposals also often contain language that is specifically intended to actually circumvent our civil rights laws. And many, despite voucher proponents' insistence, that funding does not flow to the school. It flows instead to a parent in order to, in fact, avoid civil rights obligations. And so this means that this would enable students to be discriminated against in various forms, including religious, LGBTQ status, disability, language proficiency, and even merit. And oftentimes this is a proxy for racial discrimination. This is also a huge problem when it comes to the maintenance of rights under the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, as I've also mentioned earlier. To this point, I just want to highlight two quick things. With regards, if you want to learn more about vouchers and the lack of civil rights protections, you can refer back to this report. It's online. I authored this report with SHOT Foundation and the Network for Public Education. It's Grading the States, a report card on our nation's commitment to public schools. It actually goes through the civil rights protections that are lost and what is happening in each state. And you can see by each state, actually, the overall grades for the states when it comes to protecting civil rights, as well as looking at, as I said, we looked at the types and extent of school privatization schemes and whether or not the protections for students in voucher and charter programs actually existed, their accountability measures, transparency, and other factors related to charter accountability. And I highlight that for your additional information because this is a real threat. Because as we've been hearing, there is a direction by this administration to really redirect funding to other types of programs, privatization programs, using that as a justification, using COVID-19 as a justification, and therefore also to waive, in effect, the civil rights protections that our students should have, and in fact, not allow them to achieve the quality education that they deserve. In addition to these issues of privatization, we're also dealing, as I mentioned, with many students that are eligible for free, reduced, and price lunch program, that many of our Black students, they account for 44% of those that are attending. And that, we have a high proportion within communities of color. And so they're once again, relying upon their daily meals, and the school closings have left a critical gap. I know that some school districts are trying to close that gap. I live in Fairfax County, and I know that there's been an effort to make sure that that is happening. But we also know that we're concerned about whether or not that's going to be reimbursed, because there's a lot of efforts that go beyond that have to be made in order to ensure that food, and that we don't have the food, that food is getting to the students. We don't have that food insecurity. Going to students with disabilities, there have been, the disability community has been working around the clock to ensure that there is not a waiver of the IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, or of the Rehabilitation Act in response to COVID-19. We know the latest package does require, and I know Congressman Scott will get into this, that she submit a report within 30 days of any recommendations about additional waivers that she thinks are needed. There also have been letters and other efforts that have been sent and made to the department, and also I know to Congress, really unifying upon the fact that no waivers are needed or necessary under IDEA or the Rehab Act. And this really goes to just, again, providing a basic educational rights to all students, particularly students with disabilities. We've heard some clarification by Secretary DeVos that the disability law should not prevent any school from offering educational programs, but there is a real concern about whether or not school districts are complying with this and the enforcement mechanisms behind that. Now, I wanted to, as we were hearing a little bit more about the history lessons, I just wanted to highlight the fact that the Elementary Secondary Education Act actually is a civil rights law. So as we talk about these issues of civil rights, we really do have to think of it in that context, that this is a civil rights law. It was passed, as Reg indicated, during the time of major civil rights protests, and during the time that we had the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Department of Education was created with the primary purpose, among other things, to strengthen the commitment to ensuring equal access, equal educational opportunity for every individual. And I won't go on and read all of this, but I wanted to highlight that very point, because this is why it's so important for us to talk about the protections that many of our students may be missing out on as a result of what is happening under this pandemic, and how this pandemic potentially and is being used as a justification to erode the obligations of the Department of Education and under the Elementary Secondary Education Act. So what are those rights? What is the department supposed to be doing? And what is the Office of Civil Rights supposed to be, what are they supposed to be protecting? So these are the rights. They, under Title 4 of the Civil Rights Act and Title 9, these are the two major civil rights laws that prohibit discrimination in programs and activities that receive federal financial assistance. Discrimination on the basis of race, color, and national origin is prohibited under Title 6 of the Civil Rights Act, as well as sex discrimination. In addition to that, I wanted to highlight the fact that both public and charter schools, and I think the history of charter schools was that they came out of the idea that it was simply to be innovation, to provide, to assist public schools, traditional public schools, but it was never considered to supplant the efforts of providing free and public education and quality education to all students. And so, in fact, charter schools, the way that they have been originally chartered, are public. And so therefore, they're also prohibited from often these types of discriminatory activities, as well as engaging, as well as under the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And then there's also, as I mentioned earlier, the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, IDEA, that there is also protections. So what has the Department of Justice done and Office of Civil Rights? Well, they actually have released a statement that indicates, and it is a webinar, feel free to go listen to it. It is a webinar that speaks to the federal civil rights protections in education, the laws that they are enforcing under the Office of Civil Rights, and it gives you a brief overview of their complaint process. So that does exist. However, we need to also speak to the fact that the enforcement mechanisms are unclear as to whether or not that will actually be done within the schools as a result of what is happening under COVID-19. And we also know that this administration has not been focused particularly on protecting the civil rights of communities of colors or of our vulnerable students. Under the ESSA, and let me just kind of wrap this up, there are multiple provisions of focus and focal points that they must comply with. And when I was at the Department of Education, we were focused on trying to ensure that there were real accountability measures within ESSA. And that means under, for example, and some of these bullets you'll see here, the use of Title II, III, and IV funds to support traditional disadvantaged and vulnerable public populations. And we also wanted to ensure that there's dedicated funding and protections to vulnerable students in low-performing schools. So there are real compliance issues that we are very concerned about as a result of this pandemic and its impact upon our public school students. So right now, as of March 31st, 2020, despite the requirements under ESSA, every single state has the permission to skip their statewide standardized tests, and which are required under federal law. And this has not been done, as we know, since 1994. And so the Department of Education has granted waivers to all 50 states. And so this is allowable, which means that we don't know where our students are going to be when it comes to their achievement, and trying to ensure that particularly vulnerable communities of color are getting the education that they need. But what can Secretary DeVos not do? What can she not waive? She cannot waive requirements allocating federal money to the states, school districts, and Indian tribes. That means that she just can't do away with Title I funding. Formula, however, there are some other issues within that I'm sure Congressman Scott will get to. There is also, she can't do away with the requirements that the states are still supposed to maintain their spending. That's the maintenance of effort. In order to maintain, in order to get federal dollars, they cannot supplant their own state funding. And that's a real issue. And she cannot waive requirements that they provide services to Title I schools. She also she can't waive the requirements that schools must use federal money, as I said, to supplement and not supplant their state and local funding. And she cannot waive all of the applicable civil rights requirements that I've mentioned earlier. She cannot waive the broad prohibitions on using ESSA funds for transportation purposes. And she also can't bar some other issues regarding distribution of contraceptives. There's other issues under that as well. And she cannot waive a ban on using ESSA money to pay for religious materials or instructions. However, I want to qualify that by saying that there is an effort, and we know there's some issues at play right now that the Secretary is trying to redistribute funding that was allocated under different programs to allow districts to engage in some types of voucherization programs. And again, I think Congress may get to that. So at the end, what are some of the recommendations we have that, that we can suggest in order to protect our students? Well, we've got to address the racial gap in technology. I think we always know that the digital divide existed, but it's even more evident now. We need to expand broadband access, and there are ways in which you can utilize and kind of work with companies in order to support the access of students to resources. We've got to support the students. The teachers. We've heard all about the removal and the fact that we have limits of the smaller percentages of Black teachers and principals in our schools. We're not supporting them, and we have to support them in order to support our students, because we know that they are the ones who are principally focused, and that the achievement gap excels, the achievement gap is lowered, and that we have greater opportunity for our students when we have more students, when we have more teachers of color in our schools. We also need to support our support staff and more resources for students, out-of-school students. I wanted to just emphasize we need to also support our English language learners students and students with disabilities, as well as making sure that they are receiving the learning that they deserve. And then also look our homeless students, reallocate and repurpose the unused Title I funds under the unspent McKinney-Vento and Title I funds to help districts meet the very urgent needs of our students that are currently identified as homeless, again, disproportionately in communities of color. And last but not least, we've got to ensure that the professional development is provided to educators to help facilitate this distance learning. We don't know how long it's going to last. And so not allow the secretary to reallocate funds that right now that are allocated for professional development. And last but not least, do not allow and advocate that Congress not allow Secretary DeVos to divert public school funds to support privatization schemes using COVID-19 as a justification. So with that, I end my presentation, and thank you, and I'll happy to answer any questions at the end.
Okay, Tanya, thank you so much. I appreciate that, and I know that our attendees to this webinar are very thankful for all the information that you provided, piggybacking on all that they've heard before. We are now, of course, looking forward to hearing from Congressman Scott. He's our final presenter, but he also has been a stalwart when you talk about advocacy for public education, public school educators, and labor unions across the board. He has always been there. He represents Virginia's 3rd Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives, and he's been doing that since 1993. And prior to that, prior to serving in Congress, he served 15 years in the Virginia General Assembly. Congressman Scott has an extensive profile. I'm just going to give you some of these points, and I would like for you to follow up online for him as well. But he currently serves as the chairman of the Committee on Education and Labor, and in this capacity, he is advancing an agenda that improves equity in education, frees students from the burden of crippling debt, protects and expands access to affordable health care, ensures workers have a safe workplace where they can earn a living free from discrimination, and guarantees seniors have a secure and dignified retirement. In 2015, one of the 4 primary authors of the Every Student Succeeds Act, which reauthorized the Elementary and Secondary Education Act for the first time in 13 years and replaced the No Child Left Behind Act. And so while Congressman Scott serves on the Committee on Budget, where he is a leading voice on fiscal policy and reducing deficits, he has found time in all of that to come and be available to present to us on these very important subjects as we're trying to talk about public education moving forward, and especially in a time of COVID-19, where he is very involved in all the next steps involved in ensuring that our public school students have all that they need in order to continue their education. And we know how important that is just based on Tanya's comments as it relates to what the current attacks are by Department of Education. So Congressman Scott, we look forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you, Cynthia, and I want to thank the American Bar Association and the sections that are co-sponsoring this event for bringing us together, and I'm especially pleased to be with our panelists, Leslie, Tanya, and Reg, who've explained why they're so well respected in the area of education. The title of this program, Price Paid for Brown, Desegregation and the Expulsion of Black Teachers, points to one of the downsides of school integration. When schools integrated, a lot of black teachers and black principals lost their jobs. And a lot of black students lost the opportunity to be taught by teachers who live in their neighborhoods, who often attended their churches and actually knew their families. But the debate over whether schools should be integrated or segregated, well, that debate is over. The language in the Brown v. Board of Education decision still rings true today. It said that it is doubtful that any child may reasonably be expected to succeed in life if denied the opportunity of an education. Such an opportunity is a right which must be made available to all on equal terms. The court went on to ask, does the segregation of children in public schools solely on the basis of race, even though the physical facilities and other tangible factors may be equal, deprive the children of the minority group of equal educational opportunities? We believe it does, and the court concluded that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. And that's if the factors are equal. That's rare. So a recent GAO study found that public schools are now about as segregated as they were in the 1960s, and getting more segregated not only by race, but also by class, and significant funding disparities exist, and not surprisingly, significant achievement gaps exist. Those gaps are not just in achievement. We're seeing discipline gaps. Students of color are much more likely to be suspended than other students committing similar infractions. And everybody participating in this program knows that unnecessary suspensions are a major contributing factor to the school to prison pipeline. Over the decades, Congress has tried to address the problem. First in the 1960s, Congress passed, as we've heard, ESEA, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, because they recognized that funding education primarily with the real estate tax guarantees that wealthier areas will have more resources than lower income areas. So Title I of the ESEA provided funding based on numbers of low income students. We created the Department of Education to focus more on education. And then No Child Left Behind, recognizing that there were achievement gaps that required schools to test, to ascertain the achievement gaps, and a rigid formula to address those gaps. Unfortunately, the legislation was so rigid that everybody stayed mad at the program. And so we passed the ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act, which gave flexibility to the localities to deal with this problem, but it gave no flexibility on the requirement that they ascertain, doesn't tell them how to do it, but they have to ascertain whether or not there are achievement gaps, and they have to have a credible strategy to do something about it. I've been disappointed, unfortunately, with the Department of Education, because I don't think it's been nearly aggressive enough in requiring strong, effective strategies and state plans. They've been approving plans that I think haven't gotten the job done. They've been focused too much on vouchers, and that was before the coronavirus pandemic. There's been a lot of talk recently about the disproportionate deaths suffered by minorities during the pandemic. And the universal analysis is that those disproportionate deaths are blamed on pre-existing disparities in health conditions. But we haven't had as much discussion about what's taking place in education and how the equal education is affected, because low-income ethnic minorities, English language learners, and special ed students, the very subgroups specifically required to be counted in the disaggregated data are the ones most at risk when we talk about the disparate impact. I saw that the disparate impact crystallized when I talked to a friend of mine who lives in a wealthy suburb of Atlanta. He said they closed the schools on Friday. His son was online getting instruction on Monday. The message went out that if you don't have a computer, they'll get you one. Okay, he has a brother living in rural Virginia. I talked to him when we talked about a week ago. His nephew hadn't had any instruction yet. And so those kinds of disparities are common. They're all over the place. And school districts are now, as we've heard, are now just declaring the school year over, eliminating any responsibility for continued education. The students who do not have the technology, if they go to a school that doesn't have the technology for distance learning, they'll be left behind. Or an individual student who goes to a school with the technology, if that individual student doesn't have the technology, they'll be left behind. There's no way they can do distance learning. But the good news is that we are trying to do things to deal with this problem. We passed a series of bills. One of the first bills we passed as they started closing schools was a funding for school lunches, school meals. We know that a large portion of our students get a significant portion of their daily nutrition from school meals. If the schools are closed, they're not getting school meals. We provided additional waivers and funding so that those meals could be delivered to the students. It's not a new idea. The school systems do it every summer. And so whatever you did last summer to get the meals to the student, do that. And so the students are getting the meals. Then we recognized that the disparities, and we funded about $13 billion for K through 12 to deal with the problems that the schools were having in delivering education. They may need to sanitize the schools. They may need to train the teachers on technology. They need to help the students get connected. Whatever it takes, we provided that money. Wasn't nearly enough, but it was a step in the right direction. Going forward, we need to make sure that we have additional funding for K through 12, tracking the Title I formula because that's where it's mostly needed. We need to particularly have funding for IDEA because everybody knows, although they didn't get the waivers they asked for, everybody knows that the students with disabilities are not getting the free and appropriate education that they need, and as they regress, it's going to make life that much more difficult. They didn't get waivers on civil rights. They're still asking for them. We need to make sure that those waivers aren't there. We need more money with strings attached, that the money be used to address disparities, particularly in connectivity. We need funds for summer programs. The school year is over pretty much. There's no excuse for missing the summer, because if you talk about the summer slide, that's only about a 2-month problem. Now it's about a 4-month problem, and it's twice as long. If we can get some instruction during the summer, we can do a lot to limit the effect of the summer slide. There's one thing that we have to do, and that is we have to have state and local funding in the next bill. The states are looking at a revenue shortfall of about $500 billion. Virginia just finished their legislative session. They had a nice budget. Last week they came back into session to review the budget based on revised revenue estimates. Gone was with Norfolk State University lost $100 million in construction. Teacher raises, 2% teacher raise, gone. Extra counselors who were in the budget, gone. Those are just a couple of things in the budget. And if we don't do something to backfill the revenues of the states, education, we will not have the nerve to fund the kind of education that they're going to be cutting. The first order of business has got to be state and local. So those are some of the things we're doing in the dealing with the pandemic. There are a lot of things that were just pending before the pandemic hit, like Rebuild America Schools Act. That's been reported from committee, $100 billion in school construction. We know a lot of these schools are 40, 50 years old. The elementary school I went to over 60 years ago is still there. Obviously, we need funding for school construction. College Affordability Act has been reported from committee. Students need to know that they can go to college and get through without crushing debt. They will have a different attitude K through 12 if they know they can go to college. We also need affordable college, because if we expect to be producing teachers, we have to be able to produce them without saddling them with crushing debt, which makes the teaching profession much less attractive when you have to start off with crushing debt. The two bills in terms of school segregation, the Equity and Inclusion Enforcement Act. Disparities in education cases and lawsuits on disparities in education can only be brought by the Department of Education. There's no reason why we can't have a private right of action so that a local civil rights group can bring that action. They could. A few years ago, the Supreme Court decided that they couldn't. And the Strengthen Diversity Act, which has grants. The Obama administration set up a little pool of money, $30 million, to help schools integrate their schools. A few years ago, the Supreme Court ruled that voluntary school integration plans in Louisville and Seattle were unconstitutional. This little grant program will help localities that want to do it come up with plans that can pass constitutional muster. You can do it, but you got to be careful. You got to have legal technical assistance. And when the Trump administration came in, of course, they canceled the program before any money went out. We need to reinstate those plans. But those are some of the things that we're doing. As bad as things are, we still have a lot of things that can be done to improve the situation. And frankly, the American Bar Association identifying school segregation as a problem is the first step in making sure that we can improve the lot of the next generation. So thank you, Cynthia, for your leadership, and I thank our other panelists.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this. This has been a wonderful panel. There are several questions. We're going to try to get them in. And since you have just finished speaking, Congressman Scott, I'm going to give you this question. And it really relates to, because I think it has more to do with how are we going to begin to have more funds. Our school system in Richmond, Virginia, distributed Chromebooks to the students after the schools were closed due to the pandemic. Can this be done elsewhere? And I think that speaks to some of the experience you had with your friend in Atlanta. It's like, how do we begin to make this happen?
Well, you know, if you look at how much we spend on students, adding on the expense of a Chromebook in the order of magnitude isn't that much. We spend $5, $10, $15, $20, $20,000 in that range on a student Chromebook, plus just a couple $100. So as you add that quantum leap of educational opportunity to a student that didn't have one, you don't have to provide it to everybody. A lot of them already have it. But for those that don't, you need to make that little expense will go a long way in making sure that those students aren't left behind. We also have to make sure that they can connect. Most of the cable companies have low rates for cable connection, internet connection. Most of the people entitled to benefit from that low rate don't sign up. We expanded the eligibility, so we need to make sure that the word gets out so that students that don't have the internet connection at home can get it, because the computer doesn't do you much good if you can't download your homework and Google search and that kind of thing. So the Chromebooks ought to be available in today's technology. You're not going very far in education without access to the internet.
Thank you. And for those who have questions, we're going to try to get them in, but we are running out of time. But our panelists will respond to you, even if we are not able to do it online. But Dr. Fenwick, I think that there are several questions that have to do with the career field of educators, as well as superintendents. How do people get into it if they're doing it as a second career? How do they advance if they're Black and people of color who are trying to advance into leadership? And just generally, how do we increase the number of Black and brown students who want to become educators? You're muted.
Thank you, thank you. I'll start with those who are interested in career changing. Your local university has many routes to the teaching profession, the traditional route that I went through at the University of Virginia, but many, many other routes. And I would encourage you to consult with your local university and determine the route that best matches you. These routes typically end in full certification and content expertise and exposure to pedagogy. I don't think you can microwave a teacher, so I'm encouraging you to go to universities and not other types of programs that attempt to microwave teaching excellence. We want teachers who are individuals who have changed from careers into teaching to be able to stick and stay and be competent and caring with the student populations that they serve. For those who are interested, for African American, Hispanic, Latinx, and other underrepresented groups who are interested in the superintendency, the American Association of School Administrators, AASA, sponsors an Urban Superintendents Academy intended to take teachers and principals and other educators who've had experience in our public schools and private schools for that matter, and train them on the unique context that urban superintendents work in. And so I encourage you to look up, to go to AASA's website and look at the Urban Superintendents Academy. Howard University was the first partner with AASA on the Urban Superintendents Academy, and so it has a very unique philosophical perspective and conceptual framework that guides this training of the next generation of urban school superintendents.
Okay, and Tanya, I believe that there was a question, and I don't know if you had an opportunity to answer because we had said we were going to answer it online as it relates to standardized tests. Of course, there's always been that question, and it probably came about because of your comment on standardized tests not being given the COVID-19 issue. But why, and are we still saying that standardized tests are necessary?
So yes, I did answer it, but I'm happy to say just a few things again. The issue is not just really about the use of standardized tests. I think Congressman Scott even alluded to this, that it's the rigidity of tests and how they're used in order to assess the success and achievement of students, and whether or not we're also looking at other factors that also must be considered as we're trying to lower these achievement gaps. We still need a way of understanding and discerning what the achievement gaps, whether or not achievement gaps exist. And so until that point in time that we have some other manner, we still need to utilize testing, and we still need some accountability. And this is one of the ways in which we do that. But once again, I want to reiterate, it's a complex issue that we don't necessarily mean that it's a one size fits all. But there are things that all students should learn, and that we want to ensure that there is a quality education that is provided to all of our students. And so in order to do that, we've got to have some type of accountability mechanism, and this is one way of doing it.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to have one final question, and then we're going to close. And Dr. Weaver, the question actually goes to how do we engage parents who are either absent from the home or disinterested or uninvolved. The question does not seem to necessarily go to COVID specifically as it relates to the digital divide and what may be happening there, but just generally speaking, the children and students of color, what do we do in order to engage them?
Yeah,
that will be our last question.
That's a good one. I think the first thing that I would do is try to find out a little bit more about why the parent might not be interested. Is it because they are working? Is it because they just don't care? Is it because they feel as though they don't have the skills that are necessary to help the child? As we look at what's going on with COVID, many of the things that children are now being asked to do on the internet, many parents don't feel comfortable or don't know how to help or assist their child. And so it could be perceived as though they are not interested, but that's not necessarily the case. Also, I might look to talk with the other family members to find out a little bit more about what's going on. You talk with the grandparents. In many instances, grandparents are valuable assets that are not necessarily used in order to work with parents as well as children. So, those are some of the kinds of things. I look for other agencies. Are there other agencies that can help me have more of an avenue to work with and reach a parent that might seem uninterested? So those are just a few things that I might look at. And then last but not least, you might use the pastors. A lot of times pastors have a good relationship with individuals that they can have communication with.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you so much for the panel. On behalf of the American Bar Association's Civil Rights and Social Justice section, I wish to thank you for participating in this panel. We've received a number of positive comments, and thank you. Thanks again. I really appreciate all of you being so responsive. Have a great day.
Well, thank you, Cynthia.
Bye-bye. Okay.